Welcome to the Political Science Data Podcast. I'm Ryan, your host. This podcast helps you keep up to date with political science data and research. We are in Africa today. I am joined by my good friend, Chilemba.
Hello Ryan. It is a pleasure to see you again. I am honored to be a special guest on your podcast.
This is our first podcast about African politics. We can't cover everything in just one episode, but we will try to highlight some different topics and approaches to studying African politics.
We've selected 6 articles. Some focus on the continent, others focus on specific countries. Some take us into the past, others carry us into the future. I'm excited to discuss them with you, Ryan. Are you ready to get started?
Yes, indeed. Let's get cracking. Our first article is The Political Consequences of Africa's Mobile Revolution. It was authored by Alex Yeandle. It was published by Wiley in the American Journal of Political Science in 2025. Chilemba, let's start at the beginning. What's the main question this article is asking?
The article asks how the rapid spread of mobile phones in Africa has shaped political behavior. In plain terms, Yeandle wants to know whether mobile access changes how citizens engage with politics, especially their participation and accountability demands.
That's a big question. How does this article fit into the broader research conversation?
It builds on debates about information technology and democratization. Scholars have long argued that better access to information can empower citizens, and this study brings African evidence to a literature that has often focused on other regions.
So what sort of data and research design does the author use to study this issue?
The study is observational. It uses geocoded data from Afrobarometer surveys linked with information about mobile phone coverage over time. By combining survey responses from individuals with detailed measures of whether their location had mobile service, Yeandle can estimate how access to mobile networks influences political attitudes and behaviors.
And what comes out of that analysis? What are the main findings?
The key result is that mobile phone coverage increases political engagement. People with access are more likely to discuss politics, to express criticism of government, and to hold leaders accountable. Interestingly, the effects are strongest in places where other forms of media or infrastructure are weaker, showing that mobile phones really are filling an information gap.
So who should read this article? Is it broadly useful, or more for a specialist audience?
I'd recommend it to anyone working on African politics or on information and communication technology. The article is clearly written and accessible, so even those not steeped in statistical methods can follow the logic. Its biggest contribution is showing, with strong empirical evidence, how mobile phones are reshaping citizen-state relations in Africa, so it has relevance beyond just a narrow niche.
The next article we've selected is State Reach and Development in Africa Since the 1960s, New Data and Analysis. It was authored by Carl Müller-Crepon and published by Cambridge in Political Science Research and Methods in 2023.
Thanks, Ryan. The central question here is simple but important: does the ability of African states to physically reach their citizens help improve development outcomes? The article looks at whether being closer to administrative capitals, both national and regional, translates into better education, lower infant mortality, and stronger local economies.
How does this connect to the existing literature? Where does it fit into bigger debates?
It speaks directly to long-standing debates about state capacity in Africa, especially the claim that geography and weak infrastructure limit effective governance. By providing time-varying, subnational data, it advances earlier work that often treated state capacity as fixed or measured only at the national level.
Okay, so let's talk methods. What kind of research design and data does the author use to answer this question?
This is an observational study using newly compiled panel data. The author digitized Michelin road maps and administrative boundaries to calculate yearly travel times from every 5 by 5 kilometer grid cell in Africa to the nearest national and regional capitals between 1966 and 2016. Those travel times serve as a proxy for state reach. Then, development outcomes were measured using demographic and health survey data on primary schooling and infant mortality, and satellite nightlight data as a proxy for economic activity.
That's a really creative approach. What do the results show?
The findings are quite clear. When travel times to capitals decreased, local development improved. Specifically, shorter distances to capitals are associated with more children attending primary school, lower infant mortality, and brighter nightlights. The strongest results came from national capitals, especially when countries relocated them or expanded major road networks. In other words, the increasing state reach really does foster local development.
So, stepping back, what's the key takeaway for political scientists, especially those working on Africa?
The practical lesson is that geography is not destiny. States can expand their reach, and when they do, citizens benefit. For scholars, the dataset itself is a big contribution. It opens up new ways to study state capacity, inequality in service provision, and even the roots of conflict. For African politics in particular, the article reminds us to look beyond national averages and study how infrastructure and access shape governance at the local level.
And finally, who should pick up this article? Is it mainly for specialists, or is it accessible to a wider audience?
It's definitely written for a research audience, but the clarity of the design and the importance of the question make it relevant beyond a small circle. Anyone working on African politics, state capacity, or development should read it. And even for students, it's a great example of how creative data collection, like digitizing old maps, can produce fresh insights. So I'd say it's broadly useful, not just a niche contribution.
I would like to remind listeners that political science data features all the articles discussed on this podcast on our website, policydata.com.
The articles in this episode are featured in the African Politics subfield. You can find links to full texts and replication materials online.
Let's turn our attention to an article by Robert Blair, Robert Marty and Philip Roessler. The title is Foreign Aid and Soft Power, Great Power Competition in Africa in the Early 21st Century. It was published by Cambridge in the British Journal of Political Science in 2022. What's the core question the authors are trying to answer?
At its heart, the article asks whether foreign direct investment and aid from donor countries actually strengthen development in African recipient states. But more than that, it explores how these financial flows shape the political relationship between donors and recipients, whether they build influence, trust, or dependency.
And how does that connect to the bigger international relations literature?
It builds on long-standing debates about foreign aid and soft power. Scholars ask whether aid and investment are tools of development, or if they are really instruments of influence in great power competition. This article situates Africa directly within those debates by asking if donor resources empower recipients or primarily serve donor interests.
So what's the research design here? What kind of data do the authors use to study this donor-recipient relationship?
It's an observational cross-national study. The authors analyze African countries over time, combining data on foreign direct investment and aid inflows with measures of economic performance and governance. Crucially, they look at how outcomes differ depending on the strength of state institutions in recipient countries, which helps explain whether donor resources translate into meaningful development gains.
And what do they find? How effective are these financial flows, and what do they mean politically?
The findings are nuanced. Aid and FDI do not automatically produce growth. They are much more effective when African states have strong institutions capable of channeling resources productively. In weak states, the benefits are limited, and donor support can even entrench dependency or inequality. In other terms, this means donor influence is conditional. Resources only become effective tools of soft power if the recipient has institutional capacity to use them well.
That's really interesting. So who should read this article, and why?
It's a must-read for scholars of international relations who study aid, investment, and soft power. It's also useful for policymakers, since it shows why donor strategies can succeed in some African states and fail in others. The writing is accessible enough for graduate students, but the contribution is especially important for those interested in Africa's role in global politics.
Let's now discuss cash crops, print technologies, and the Politicization of Ethnicity in Africa. The authors are Yannick Pengl, Philip Roessler, and Valeria Rueda. It was published by Cambridge in the American Political Science Review in 2022. Let's begin with the core question. What is this article trying to figure out?
The article asks why and how ethnicity became politically salient in Africa. More specifically, it looks at the historical role that economic structures, like cash crop production and the spread of print technologies, played in shaping whether ethnic identities turned into political cleavages.
Interesting. How does this fit into the existing scholarship on African politics?
It connects to classic debates about the origins of ethnic politics. Some scholars emphasize colonial institutions, others stress modernization and communication. This article bridges those perspectives by showing how economic incentives and the information environment interacted to politicize ethnicity.
So how do the authors actually study this? What's the design and what data do they use?
This is a historical observational study. The authors compiled district-level data across multiple African countries, measuring where cash crops were cultivated during the colonial era and tracking the arrival of print technologies like newspapers and missionary presses. They then linked this to later measures of ethnic politicization, including voting patterns and political mobilization.
And what do they find? What's the main takeaway from the results?
They find that cash crop production by itself did not necessarily politicize ethnicity. But when combined with the spread of print technology, those areas were much more likely to see ethnic identities politicized. In short, the economic base created interests, and print communication provided the means to organize and mobilize along ethnic lines.
That's a powerful conclusion. So, who should read this article? Is it mainly for specialists in African history, or does it speak more broadly?
It's most directly relevant to scholars of African politics and comparative politics, especially those interested in ethnic conflict and political development. The writing is clear and the argument well grounded in evidence, so advanced students could also learn a lot from it. Its contribution is more than just incremental, it deepens our understanding of how structural and informational factors combine to make ethnicity a key axis of politics in Africa.
Let's turn our attention to an article by Sara Lowes and Eduardo Montero. Concessions, Violence, and Indirect Rule, Evidence from the Congo Free State was published by Oxford in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2021. This article features historical research. What's the central question the authors are asking here?
The article asks whether the brutal exploitation of the Congo Free State under King Leopold II had long-lasting effects on development in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In plain language, it's trying to determine if the violence and forced labor of that era still shape political and economic outcomes today.
So how does this connect with what scholars have already said about Africa's historical legacies?
It's part of a broad literature on the colonial origins of underdevelopment. While many studies treat colonialism in general terms, this article zeroes in on one of the most extreme cases of exploitation to test whether we can see measurable legacies more than a century later.
And what kind of data and design does the author use to get at that question?
The study is observational and historical. The author digitized records of robber concessions and violent incidents during the Congo Free State period, then linked those locations to modern data on education, health, and economic activity. The analysis compares areas that were heavily exposed to exploitation with those that were less affected.
And what emerges from that analysis? What are the main findings?
The findings show stark, persistent effects. Areas most exposed to robber exploitation and violence still have worse outcomes today: lower schooling, weaker health indicators, and lower economic development. The article argues that the extreme violence disrupted local institutions and created patterns of mistrust and underinvestment that endured long after the colonial period ended.
That's striking. So who should read this article? Is it narrowly historical or useful more broadly?
It's a must-read for scholars of African politics and development, and also valuable for anyone studying the long-run effects of colonialism. While the methods are technical, the argument is clearly presented, so it's accessible to a wider research audience, including graduate students. Its contribution is significant because it ties one of Africa's darkest historical episodes directly to contemporary underdevelopment.
Thank you so much. I'm interested in discussing civilian protest in civil war, insights from Côte d'Ivoire. This article was authored by Sebastian van Baalen. It was published by Cambridge in APSR in 2024. Chilemba, let's dig into this article on Côte d'Ivoire. What's the main question the author is asking here?
The article investigates why civilians protest during civil wars, even though such actions can be extremely risky. In simple terms, it asks, under what conditions do ordinary people mobilize and challenge armed groups in the midst of violent conflict?
That's a tough puzzle. How does this research connect to the existing literature?
It contributes to broader debates on civil conflict and collective action. Most studies focus on why people fight or flee, but this article emphasizes a third option, protest, expanding our understanding of civilian agency during wartime.
So how does the author study this question? What kind of data and research design are we talking about?
The study uses original survey data collected in Côte d'Ivoire after the Civil War, combined with qualitative interviews. The survey captures individual experiences, the exposure to violence, and unwillingness to protest. The author then analyzes how different community-level factors, like ethnic composition and relationships with armed groups, shaped patterns of protest during the war.
And what do the results show? What stands out from the findings?
The findings suggest that protest was more likely in communities where civilians could coordinate and felt a degree of collective protection. People who experienced direct violence were often fearful, but in contexts where communities had strong social cohesion, protest still emerged as a strategy to influence armed actors. In other words, protest wasn't random, it reflected organized responses to local conditions.
That's really insightful. So who should read this article? Is it mainly for conflict specialists, or does it have a broader appeal?
It will be most useful for scholars of African politics and civil war, but also for anyone studying collective action under authoritarian or high-risk settings. The article is clearly written and makes a unique contribution by centering civilian strategies during conflict, so it's valuable both to specialists and to students looking for new perspectives on civil war dynamics.
Chilemba, you've walked us through 6 major contributions on African politics. Let me step back and ask you this, for someone who's followed African politics for a long time, what's the most surprising finding in this new research?
What's striking is the range of ways Africa is being reshaped by forces often overlooked. The mobile revolution is a great example. Cell phones changed access to information and political participation in ways that surprised many who assumed weak infrastructure was a permanent barrier. Similarly, the evidence that state reach, literally the ability to reduce travel times to capitals, translates into real development gains challenges the old idea that geography is destiny. Taken together, the surprise is how dynamic and contingent African politics really are.
Several of these studies use innovative datasets, geocoded surveys, digitized colonial records, historical concessions data. What do you think this tells us about the direction of methods in African politics research, and what kind of data do we still desperately need?
That's a great question, Ryan. The common thread across these studies is how far African politics research has come in terms of data innovation. We've moved well beyond anecdotal accounts or broad cross-national indices. Instead, scholars are using geocoded surveys to capture local variation, digitizing colonial records to trace long-term legacies, and linking archival data with modern indicators. This shows the field is becoming much more rigorous and micro-level in its approach. But the big gap is still in systematic administrative data from African states themselves, reliable budget data, subnational service delivery, and consistent records of political violence or protest. If we had that kind of infrastructure, the discipline could answer questions with even greater precision and policy relevance.
That's fascinating. Now, if we shift to a policy audience, foreign policymakers and business leaders investing in Africa, what's the biggest lesson they should take from these studies?
The key lesson is that institutions and history matter. FDI, for instance, only pays off when governance is strong. The ethnic politicization work reminds us that communication and economic structures shape conflict risks in unexpected ways. And the Congo Free State study demonstrates that extreme historical violence casts a long shadow shaping outcomes even today. For outsiders, that means strategies that ignore institutional capacity and historical legacies are likely to disappoint. Whether you are making policy or investing, success depends on engaging with the political and social context on the ground.
And finally, looking ahead, based on these 6 articles, what's the single most important unanswered question for future research on African politics?
The big unanswered question is how these different forces interact. We now know that technology, infrastructure, institutions, and historical legacies all matter. But how do they combine? Does digital connectivity mitigate the effects of weak state reach, or does FBI amplify ethnic cleavages under certain conditions? Future research needs to connect these strands into a more integrated understanding of Africa's political development, because the continent's future will be shaped not by one factor alone, but by the way they intersect.
Thank you so much for sharing your analysis with us.
You're welcome, Ryan. And thank you for visiting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about African politics research with you.
And of course, we thank you, dear listener, for joining us on the Political Science Data Podcast.